All right, and welcome back to Better Understanding the Bible. We're having another conversation, talking origins with Mercy. And just like to say, hi, how's it going? Back for another one.
That's right. Here we are, and here we are going to talk about the suzerain vassal treaty in the context of, hey, what does the blessings and the cursings lead to?
That's the big one. At the end of the day, it seems to be, the crux of the whole matter, right? We follow it all the way through, and it's sin, of course. And so, suzerain vassal treaty is what we've been studying. And when we're taking this conversation forward, we have to then come into, well, if we're talking about a people that were transitioning in time from the Paleolithic into the Neolithic system, we see writing coming into being, empires are emerging, covenants are emerging, the suzerain vassal treaties emerging. We do have this all written down, and that's where we've learned all this, the Hittite vassal systems. These are historical and there's lots of them. That's what's so nice about this is a well understood system that has been brought to our awareness now, and this is probably the most important thing when it comes to discussing the Bible that we need as a foundation. Without this foundation of understanding the suzerain vassal treaty and what it means, especially because today, like we're going to talk about sin, it's probably one of the biggest issues in the whole Bible. Well, then what does sin even mean in regards to a covenant treaty? Or, is it common belief is the whole world's under sin? When we take a look at Romans, we see Paul attributing sin to Adam. So, depending on the conversations you've had and where we've kind of come from, sin's a pretty big deal, bringing us all the way back to Genesis again. And of course, the conversation of why was the Bible written? Well, what again, the two big points was Israel was being created as Moses is bringing them out of Egypt. He brings them to Mount Sinai. And then we read in the Deuteronomy that Moses wrote down this law during that transition time. So that's when the Torah is being written. And what did he write it down as? As a suzerain vassal treaty between him and God. That then transition us back to Adam. Why was Adam in the Bible? Yeah, I'm just going over what we've already covered, just to bring this into perspective, because Adam now is also being put under a suzerain vassal treaty system as well. And Moses is claiming that this system is now also transitioning from Adam all the way up to Israel. Well,
Mhm.
that's a big deal, because what is sin? What is this whole conversation? How does it fit into this vassal treaty system? What is the old covenant? What does the new covenant have to do with sin? Are we sinners? Are we going to have? There's so much stuff. Hopefully, all I've done in this little intro is piqued your curiosity. That's what we're going to tackle today. Is where's sin? What does it mean in the Bible? What was the Bible talking about sin? When it meant it? How should it apply to us? And it's a can of worms, so we saved it for this one. So I'm going to ask you, Mercy, as far as sin is concerned, like as far as the church is concerned, like moral law, moral dilemma, the pressure, the burden on man to behave in a certain way, to be acceptable, appropriate to God, not living up to those demands. That's pretty much what the church would describe, and is what sin is to some degree, right?
Right. So the basis of being a Christian or having a relationship with God, told through a evangelical Christian lens, is that, oh, we have a problem. Problem is that we have sin. So, through the Christian manifesto and through the church culture, we have been indoctrinated that sin is like a personal issue and that we were all born with sin. We all, have this personal issue. But see, there's a big disconnect with that kind of theology or doctrine, because when we put the Bible at the forefront, and what does the Bible say? With the Susan Vassal Treaty being a backbone of the Bible, it is not a personal issue. It's actually a covenantal issue. It's actually a treaty. It's between a suzerain and a vassal, meaning during the time when these empires and kingdoms are building, how do you do that? You have to have law. See, before it was lawless or people just did whatever in clans or families. Now you have a whole civilization. How do you put order and function into this? Well, you have to bring the law now. That makes common sense, right? This is how we're evolving as humans and as we're living together and your neighbor and all of this stuff. We have to have these laws. And so when you bring in the Suzerain Vassal Treaty, you're talking about the stipulations, the laws. That's the third part of this treaty. Now you have, well, if you don't follow this and this and this in the law, then you have sinned, you have transgressed. We need to put that perspective back into the Bible. I'm not talking about today of universal failings and moral failings, and we can talk about that all we want, and that is still here. That's part of human nature. I'm not talking about that. We're talking about specifically, what does the Bible say sin is? Sin is in relationship to a transgression. When we look at Jesus and he says, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, or forgive us of our transgressions, right? And those that have transgressed against us. Those are legal terms. We are reading a legal document in the Bible that was a suzerain vassal treaty, and that if they broke those stipulations, you were in sin. Now we use that word today and we have our own definitions, but back then it was a transgression. And we need to understand that when we're reading the Bible. We cannot personalize something when we haven't even contextualized. And I love what John Walton says here. If the Bible never meant that in the first place, it can't mean that now. So why are we saying this means this now when it never meant that in the time of the Bible? This is contextualization. This is audience relevance when we're talking about these terms. And I know so many people, they're like, oh, yeah, we do that. Oh, yeah, I understand that. No, you don't. Because if you don't understand what it meant in this context of the biblical suzerain vassal treaty, the covenantal system, and that there was a law, people had to live by that, and that if they broke that law, it was a transgression.
Yeah, when we get into like, if we want to get the nitty gritty and really kind of put a modern perspective on it, because these are some terms that, very Christian-y terms, very historical, kind of scholarly terms. What is sin specifically? So, yeah, transgression, but what is that even really kind of talking about? Like, there's heavy words that are, sayings even in the Bible. Sin is transgression of the law. Very famous scripture. Well, what's transgression? What's sin? How can sin be? Well, what is trans? So let's get some terms out of the way here. So sin is an archery term, and what that's talking about is missing the mark. You set up your the target, and you pull your arrow back, and you fling it, and you try to hit the target. So you're shooting. The goal is I'm pulling, I'm shooting, and if I miss, that's a sin. I missed the target, so I missed my shot. So the principle behind the idea of sin is I did not accomplish what I was trying to do. I failed at adhering to what I was doing. I shot my arrow and I missed the target. That gets applied in the description of the law. Well, what again is the law? That was the agreement between Moses and Israel and God. God, through Moses, sent Moses down to Israel in Exodus 19 and said, this is what I want you to do. Will you do it? If you do, I'll give you these benefits. And they said, okay. And he said, well, if you do, then I require these things. And they said, okay. So in Exodus, the covenant agreement was said. God proposed, Israel accepted. It was an agreement. And what's really important about that is we got to understand this is probably the most important moment in the Bible for context, because after that moment going forward, the entire Bible shifts context, and now we see the covenant people, the treaty people. So this is why the law becomes very important, is because that agreement becomes the. Why don't we just pull this up here, and I'm going to go to Exodus 19, and we'll give this a quick read. And read this right from the beginning, just to bring this into context for us, because what's said here is very specific, and it does help us realize how clearly these things are said. So 19:1, again, we're just to catch us up. Moses has delivered the people out of Egypt to Mount Sinai, and now he's going up Mount Sinai in order to talk to God. And that's what we find here on Exodus 19:1. Now, on the third new moon after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness at Sinai. And they set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness at Sinai and camped at the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain where while Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel." And here's where God proposes. So Egypt's history now. Israel's pulled out of Egypt. They're at the base of the mountain. God has wooed them through the wilderness, brought them to his place, and he proposes, saying, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to all the people of Israel." Verse 7. So Moses came and called the elders of the people and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him, saying, and all the people answered together, saying, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." So we have an actual agreement.
Mm.
Israel, who was the weak, the lesser, the subordinate, who was left to their own accord in Egypt with nothing, oppressed even. And God came as a knight in shining armor, and he saved his wife out of Egypt, pulling his woman across the sea out of danger of the pursuers into a new land. And he brought him to himself at his own mountain. And he then proposed and said, "I will be your God if you will be my people." And it was all good and dandy. The whole relationship began. Well, that's what's really important is, and I'm just going to highlight the one word that seems to really need to be exemplified in here, as he says in verse 5, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant." If. That's because this is a covenant agreement. The covenant includes covenant stipulations. As we heard, it said you must be obedient and faithful to the covenant. And so when we see these stipulations, these actually get expanded in great detail in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, where we see in this Exodus agreement, it says, "If you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant." Well, in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, we get a whole listing of this is what you should do, and this is what I will do. And these are divided into two groups called blessings and curses. And Mercy had brought this up, and this is now the stipulations. If you do A, B, C, and D, which I deem as good, then I will give you these blessings. But if you do A, B, C, and D, which I say are bad, I will give you these curses. And now, what's interesting about these conditions is when you transgressed those conditions, you were sinning against the covenant. You were shooting, that was your target. The goal of your effort was to adhere, to be faithful and obedient to the covenant so that you would be the kingdom of God.
Mhm.
So this is a really big, important issue of sin and transgression because there's an agreement between the people of Israel, the kingdom of Israel, and the people of God and God in heaven. And those two came together and signed a treaty in word. They agreed to it in word, and they were now together as one. So now this condition, not only is it seen as an agreement, but this is two households coming together. And therefore, there's requirements. God has to protect the people. He has to provide food for the people. And that's part of those blessings. That's the good side of the law. That's the two-edged sword, the one that brings life. But there's also the other side of that, which is the curse, which is the if you don't follow my commandments, if you don't. And we've seen this throughout the whole of Scripture, how Israel constantly broke covenant, were kicked off the land, removed from all the blessings and prosperity of life, only to be brought back to the land after being forgiven so that they could break the covenant once again and be booted off the land again. And we see these punishments coming in with the neighboring nations destroying and bringing judgment. And we see this based upon their ability to not transgress the covenant. One of the major aspects is being faithful, right? That being true. And that means not having any other gods in your system. Well, that just makes logical sense now from a treaty point of view. God is their king, their ruler, their one. They are under that treaty. They're not allowed to have another king. Well, that's treason. Of course, that makes sense. So if they transgress that agreement, they're sinning. And that's the equivalent of death. So that's why, because it breaks order, it breaks the system. That's sinning. That's the law. That's the put in the perspective. Every single living moment of every day of every breath of the Hebrew life was adherence to the law. So this is a pretty big deal.
Mhm.
When we take a look at Daniel, and when we take a look at Paul in the New Testament, I think it's Paul who quotes him. Yeah, it's Paul who says, all have sinned, all, not one or two, were bad people. Every member of the covenant failed. So here we're having the greatest position. We have at the beginning where they hadn't sinned, they're perfect in covenant, they just made the agreement. And we have at the end with the arrival of Jesus, we have the condemnation that every single one has sinned. So we went from a transition from a people that God loved and brought out of Egypt all the way forward to a people who all they are is sinners. Nothing they do is good. They break the covenant. They don't live by it. And their leaders teach them to not live by it because they rule over God's law with their own traditions. And that teaches, that spreads sin. It spreads transgression. It spreads not living by the agreement. So I'm just putting brackets on that for right now. And just to say, what we need to do is realize that this is the foundation for which the people in the Bible were trying not to sin from. They were trying not to break the commandments. They tried, what were they shooting at? The sin, they were the archer, they're the archer. They were shooting at being faithful and obedient. That's a covenant requirement. Really think about that. I'll leave that hot potato out there. Faith is a covenant requirement, it's a works. Faith and obedience was the covenant of Exodus 19:15, which was worked out in the people and God via a suzerain vassal treaty, which is common, which we understand. And that's where the sin relationship exists. The sin relationship, and I'll ask Mercy if she wants to expand on this. There's no sin relationship without the law, because the law, the agreement, that's what determines the party who made this. So the suzerain in this and the vassal, those are the two participants in the agreement. Therefore, they're the only ones who can participate in whether or not a transgression is even taking place. Did you want to unpack that a little bit, Mercy?
Yeah, couple of things. Like when we go into Genesis and God tells Adam that if you eat of this, you will die. There's this connection of sin, and the blessings is life, and the cursing is death, right? And we think, oh, it's a physical thing that's happening here. I want the audience to think of it as a covenantal term. For us, we think of it in the way that I just explained. But in the biblical context, when you're understanding this suzerain vassal treaty, what you're seeing is that the covenant standing was in two different positions. If you were in the blessing and it was good, then you had life. So eternal life for them meant, oh, you are going to be continuing in this good relationship with the suzerain vassal, And it's good because you have protection, you have provision, you have land expansion, you have trade, you have all of these things. So this was life, like and you can have it eternally, like from this generation to the next, to the next, to the next. But if you don't, the consequences was very severe, and it was a death to that relationship. If you had a death between a suzerain and vassal, oh my goodness, you pretty much died out. If you didn't go into exile, or if you didn't go into another clan or another city state that took you in, you were going to die. And so this was a death position, and there was heavy, heavy consequences of that, right? So in this concept of sin, you have life and death. I set life and death before you. Please put this in the context of this covenantal system. This is covenantal or biblical language. So now, when you understand that piece, and now
Before
you,
you move away from that, I
okay,
just want to throw in there a reminder that those exact stipulations are what Israel were also placed under as well when they made this covenant agreement in Deuteronomy 30, where God says, I set before you heaven and earth today, life and death, the blessing and the curse. Therefore, choose life so that you and your offspring or your seed after you shall live. And that's right. Like there's a physical aspect, but that's because of the covenantal agreement that the blessing or the curse would be poured out. And just to tie into what you were saying there, Mercy, that's the exact same position we see Adam with that choice of life and death in the garden.
and Paul talks about it too in First and Second Corinthians and Galatians, when he's talking about, I've been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives within me. The life I live in the body, right, by faith and through His love that's given to me. What is he talking about here? Remember, with this sin language, it's a transgression, meaning you can't have sin without the law, and the law was only for, this is a big one now, for the covenantal people. It didn't extend outside of a marriage vow. When you make a marriage vow, it's between two people. It's not between, all of these other people. And we understand that. But somehow, when we get to the Bible, we don't understand that. We inject ourselves into the text. Remember, this is an ancient text, it's a cross cultural experience. And when you go into it, the transgression can only be done through the parties that decided to agree upon that. So if I may real quick, you talked about Daniel. Daniel chapter 9, verse 11. Daniel, and he is one of the exiles, one of the first exiles to be taken out of the land during the Babylonian captivity around 600 BCE. But everyone gets into exile. There's three different exiles at 586 BCE. But here is Daniel, and he's praying for his people. But look at the language that he is using. He is only praying for his people, because it's his people that broke or that transgressed against that law, or that sinned against that law. So this is the context of the Bible. So in Daniel chapter 9:11, he says, indeed, all Israel has transgressed your law and turned aside. He's not praying for anyone else, because nobody else was under this stipulation, this covenantal system, not obeying your voice. So the curse has been poured out on us, meaning that they broke the stipulations. And what are the consequences? It's exile. It's you lost the land. It's you don't have the protection anymore. Da 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 da. And then, along with the oath which is written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, for we have sinned against him. This is really, really critical to understand. It's just with the people that the Bible is dealing with. And from the first Adam all the way to the last Adam, you're dealing with the people of Israel. And then, of course, at the end, the people of Judea. And then the ex Israelites and the ex Jews that are brought into the new covenant with Jesus. But it's with this two covenant parties that you are understanding what the term sin is referring to. It's with these people.
I'd like to point out too in that verse, because it's very appropriate, as when we take a look at the language, it says, all Israel has transgressed your law. We were literally just reading in Exodus what law they transgressed: the law of Moses, the agreement, which was, as we just read, to be faithful and obedient. And what's the very first thing he says? All Israel has transgressed your law. Well, it was, first of all, it was only Israel who entered that covenant, which Mercy pointed out so rightfully. And then all Israel has transgressed your law and turned aside, refusing to obey. That's one of the two initial stipulations, to obey and be faithful. So the accusation here is you're refusing to obey. Then it's followed up by, but now as a result of your the lack of obedience, the curse from the oath, what oath? The oath of Exodus, when they swore to God to be in his covenant. It said, and the curse and oath that are written in the law of Moses have been poured out upon us because we have sinned. We have what? They did not obey. That's what the sin was. They were trying to obey. They were trying to obtain the covenant. They were pulling that back and they were shooting the arrow at obedience. But they sinned. They missed the target. Really let that sit in. This is the language they're using. This is the covenantal attachment. God and Israel made an agreement to be faithful and obedient. And right here in Daniel 11, we weren't obedient. That's what sin is, if we want to paraphrase it for this conversation. And that's very important to see, because that's now moving forward into the New Testament.
Mhm.
What do we find happening there? We find the end of the law language. We find the end of sin language. In fact, just because Mercy brought us into this chapter, if we just slowly go down to verse 24 in Daniel 9. So here we have in Daniel 11, pointed out by Mercy, saying the accusation against Israel was their inability to live up to, shoot correctly at, and obtain the covenant of Exodus 19 through their obedience. The Messiah is going to be sent and bring an end to this. And we see that in verse 24. So Daniel's saying, because you guys weren't obedient, this is what's going to happen. 77 weeks. And of course, this is famous. If you're preterist and you're here, most of you listening are preterists. We're sick of this, but hopefully this will jump out at you today in this context. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression.
Mhm.
What's the very first thing he's decreeing? 77 weeks are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression. He just told us what the transgression was: not living up to the covenant agreement Israel made with God. So
Yes,
this has nothing to,
and on other translations to end sin. That's mind blowing, right?
well, that's actually in my translation, that follows it up saying 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression and to put an end to sin. That's a really big deal, because who's doing this? This is the Messiah. When we take a look at this in context, verse 25, we start to see that the anointed one will appear. This is at the time of the Messiah arriving. So when we see 70 weeks decreed for your people in your holy city to finish transgression, well, the transgression was Israel's inability to live up to the Mosaic agreement, the Sinai agreement. So this isn't talking about the United States. This is talking about Australia. No, it's not talking about Australia or Russia or any of these places. This is literally specifically talking about the Exodus agreement, that at the time of Daniel, God making it known, look, you guys have had your opportunities, but you've missed. You've made many shots and you've transgressed. So the judgment has been determined.
So can I just inject real quick here? Just look at the grace period that God gave. It was a whole jubilee cycle, 7 times 7. Every Shemitah was, every seventh year you would release all the debt. But then on the jubilee, on the 49th year, you would release the debt, and then on the 50th year it was jubilee, but you would start another whole cycle. Well, look at the grace period that God gave through the prophecy, through Daniel here written down, that it was 70 times 7, 490 years. That's a huge Jubilee cycle. And it's a call for the people of Israel, the people in this vow, this covenant, to come back. And what happens, he already says, hey, there's going to be the last Adam that comes, and he's going to end the whole consciousness or this concept of sin at that time. And it happened just perfectly when Jesus came as the last Adam.
And how is this going to be accomplished? Well, according to verse 24, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness. So, righteousness is a term for living up to the agreement of the law. Iniquity is a description of those who did not live up to the requirements of the law. So 490 years, then the Jubilee begins. Why? And the beginning gives us a finish to transgression. How can you bring an end to transgression?
Through the Jubilee cycle, you
By the
release,
bringing the end of the covenant.
yes. But on a blowing of the trumpet, the Jubilee, right? I mean, that was the most sacred time of the year.
Well,
That's
and it was a big deal, right? This was the end, like you were saying, like at the last Adam. This is a really big deal.
huge. This is the mother lode of all. And all the people at that time knew what they meant. Like, oh my gosh, we're actually going to perform a Jubilee cycle, which they never actually did. But then here comes God, and he says, I'm going to do it through Jesus. He's going to fulfill it.
And what we have is this description where it's going to finish transgression. Well, that's where we start getting some interesting language as we move into the New Testament, because what how do you finish a transgression? How do you bring an end to sin, as Daniel says the Messiah is going to do? Well, according to Paul, where there is no law, there can be no transgression of that law. Paul starts talking about what Daniel said. He's going to bring an end to this people. Now, Paul said the people came to an end. And with that people coming to an end came the end of that agreement, which makes logical sense. For if Israel and God entered into agreement in Exodus, the end of that agreement then would be the end of the ability to transgress that law. If there's no agreement, I can't break any rules. So that then gives us a really cool bookend. That means with Israel specifically, Sinai to what? To the cross of Christ, because that's the new covenant. That's the blood poured out for the transgressions of the sins, according to Hebrew 8 and 9, for the sins committed under the first covenant. So Jesus's blood paid for those Israel sins, which what we just read in Daniel to get with atonement, so that they would be made righteous. They brought in everlasting righteousness. But they were now no longer in that Moses system. They died to that Moses system. They're no longer. They left the city of Jerusalem and they went into a new Jerusalem. They left the covenant of Moses and they went into the covenant of Jesus. So they were under a new obligation. I like to parallel this to being like, okay, corporations own everything. So when I was working for the corporation Best Buy, when I joined that corporation, I had now rules and obligations, and they had rules and obligations. They had to pay me, they had to make sure I got my bonuses, they had to make sure I was trained, they had to make sure I had dental coverage and all these other things. But I had to make sure that I showed up to work, I had to hit targets, I had to do all these other things. And as long as I lived up to those agreements, I got all those blessings and bonuses. The moment I didn't live up to those agreements, I was put on, extended time periods where you didn't get hours. All of a sudden, you had to do retraining. You were put into lower positions of authority. You had less privileges. So all of a sudden, the job became a burden, and you didn't want to be there anymore. But when you were in the blessings, you're raining down bonus checks and going on trips, and all of a sudden, life's great. So when I was following the rules of the agreement I made with them, and I got the blessings, it was good in life. But when I wasn't following the agreements, it was awful. It was like I was cursed. It was death. But when I quit, a neat thing happened. I was no longer following or subject to those rules. And obviously, if you quit a job, the last thing you want is your job calling you at home saying, and giving you crap for you're not working there anymore. But now that I've left that job, I'm going to go, I don't know, let's go work at, I don't know, Circuit City. Everyone should know Circuit City, the opposition, whatever. Or some furniture store just for fun. So I go and work at some furniture store now. Well, when I agree to some furniture store, now I'm going to have a whole new agreement with them, a whole new covenant. And I'm going to have new rules, new things that I have to do. Or even better, let's say I go into construction, totally different system. Like I'm not even selling stuff. There's not even products. Now I have to go to building. So it's a completely different, but I still have to make an agreement where I have to learn how to do things and live up to that agreement. And if I don't live up to that agreement, I'm going to have punishments. So
Mhm.
I'm not going to get raises. I'm not going to be able to go on vacation. I'll probably, get the crappier hours. All those kind of things will come around on me if I don't live up to the agreement. But I'm still no longer under the Best Buy agreement. No matter if I do good or bad under the new agreement, Best Buy will never, ever have authority over me because I am dead to them. I am not part of their system anymore. And that's what we see happening when Jesus arrives. Those who were in the system of Moses, who were indebted to the agreement of Sinai, they left that agreement and joined into the agreement with Jesus. So they
Mhm.
were under a whole new banner. They left Best Buy and they're now working at Walmart, right? Whatever you want to call it. They left Best Buy. They're now, working at Mercedes, because I know that might offend some people. So whatever. But the idea is pretty clear that what we're doing is they're completely detached from one another. And that's what happened was the law agreement that did cause transgression. What we see in the New Testament with Jesus coming was they switched. They went outside of that agreement. So the law agreement of Moses could no longer speak to their lives. They were no longer under its authority. They were raised up from it. While in it, they were dead, but they were raised up out of that and lifted up into the new position in a new covenant agreement, which didn't adhere to the Moses agreement anymore, because they had in Jesus the faithful and obedient one. He obtained everything in that agreement and gave it to them simply by faith. So they had a different agreement.
Mhm.
So when we take a look at that kind of language and we get into the New Testament, I'm sure Mercy has a lot to say about why we see what the authors now are kind of getting into, because that's the whole focus of the New Testament, is the transition from the old agreement of Sinai with Israel into the new agreement with Jesus, in which we see no sin.
Mhm. Right. So when Paul is speaking in Romans, he's speaking to ex-Israelites and ex-Jews that believe because they were exiled or cut off from the land that they were dead. They were dead from that covenantal system. They could not come back, and they thought they were lost forever. This is where we see the parable of the lost coin, the lost son. This is the story really of Joseph, the 10 tribes being lost. And so when he's sharing this with the Romans and all the other letters, they're familiar with it, and he's having to tell them that you were once lost, you were once dead, in the Mosaic law, but now you are alive in Christ. This is the first time that they heard this, and this was the gospel. They would have received this as the good news. Now you are not dead anymore, but now you are alive in Christ, because Jesus was the last Adam. Jesus was a savior of their sins. So when we talk about, the church talking about, oh, Jesus needs to save you from their sins, well, in the context of the Bible, it was referring to those people that were under this covenantal system, that they had to be saved out of this death position, come into the life position that was now provided by the new what? Vassal, or the royal messenger, the mediator between, God, the suzerain, and the people. This would have been Jesus, just like Noah was, just like Abraham was, just like Moses was. And so this new position, they are now being told, because they're not in the land, they're not in Jerusalem, they're outside of that. Paul is now going to them and telling them, no, this is all that has happened. Daniel prophesied, and he's explaining these things and saying now, just like a will, when a father dies, he has to die first of all to have that will given. Well, this first will is no longer, and we have a second will. This is a transference that's happening between the cross and 70 AD, where all of those that wanted to come into the new will, they could. But if you didn't, you would have been in that death curse position. If you did come in, then you would have all the blessings. This is the biblical context of what we're saying when we say Jesus came to save us, or to save these people, to save from sin. This is the context. And I hope that going through these verses, going through these conceptual things through the Suzerain Vassal Treaty, that people that are watching this is getting to understand what the Bible is actually saying. Because the law is no more. And if you don't have a law, then you can't sin against a law that no longer exists. So therefore, there is no transgression. There is no law. Like Daniel 9 is saying, he put an end to that whole system.
What's really neat, as you were saying, jumping into my head, is when Stephen was being persecuted, what was he saying that really got under their skin at the end of the day was that the systems of Moses were going to pass away. That was the accusation was, are you preaching that we should no longer follow Moses? And he goes, yeah. Basically, he's like, yeah, that stuff's done. It's over with. And then he goes on a big speech about why. And he concludes his speech with, in Acts 9 or 7, verse 53, you who received the law as delivered by angels and did not keep it. So what we're seeing is getting our mind around what sin is in the Bible. It's tied to this community of Israel and their agreement to God. And that over time, they didn't live up to that agreement. And every time they failed to live up to that agreement, it was called sin. That's just the term they used for it. Failure, insubordination, whatever you want to call it. Now, when we move up to Daniel, we're told Messiah is going to be sent, and he's going to bring an end to this system. What system? The agreement of Exodus and the law and the structures set up there to command the people what they need to do in order for God to bless them and make them plentiful, and to make them righteous, and to give them food for all. It was to rule their kingdom, and they lived by that. So let's be fair to one degree, because now we have a guy showing up on the scene saying, yeah, all that's done. You don't need that anymore. That'd be hard to hear. But that's why with the prophets, they're being told, like, look, this is coming, this is coming, this is coming. And then it came. And that's where we have to.
Years, that's a long time. They heard it over and over and over and over. It didn't happen the way they expected, but nonetheless, they heard this. They knew this.
And they were expecting an end to what they were in, an end of transgression. Well, this is really interesting, because when it goes, then it even says, right, specifically in Daniel, not only the end of the transgression, which when you, as Paul said, where there is no law, there can be no transgression of that law. Well, then it says to make an end of sin. Well, we also find in the letters of John a very interesting section where John says that those who know God don't sin. In fact, they can't sin because his seed abides in them. That's very tricky for people to understand. But if we look at it in the tense of the Suzerain Vassal Treaty system transfer, well, if you were in Moses and you were living by the law, trying to be obedient and faithful, and you were successful, you would be Jesus. So everybody else was a failure. Well, those who transferred out of that failure system into Jesus's system, they are now succeeded. They're not even shooting an arrow anymore. The transfer, they no longer have a promise of a transfer to come into a better system. They transferred. They left Moses and became one in Jesus. As a result, as Hebrews 4 talks about, they were given rest from their works. They didn't have to try anymore. They had no arrows left to shoot. They got the bullseye. Jesus's arrow. Jesus went up to the hallmark and said, "Okay, guys, okay, hey. You see Goliath over there, the target with the center? You see that Goliath? I'm going to take my bow, my sling, I'm going to hit it. And all my army is going to benefit on my action. If I hit, we're all good. If I miss, we're all their slaves." That's what they were riding on, was that in Jesus, Jesus hit the mark. And anyone who joined with Jesus got that similar position. All those who stayed with Moses received the similar position as Moses, who what? Did not get allowed to leave and cross the Jordan. He died. Moses died before entering the promised land. That's their head. All Moses could ever do is lead you to death before the promised land. So here's Jesus, who brought an end to the law because he fulfilled it. There's now no, you can't do it. He has it. He was given the reward. No, you can try all you want. You could even accomplish it, but the prize box is empty. It was empty, taken out, and the keys were given to him. He got the Lamborghini. There's no prize in the law anymore. So even if someone were to miraculously resurrect this agreement that we can't participate in, and that's what the Jews were looking at. Here you have the apostles, this new message saying, Adam's dead. Moses is dead. There's nothing left in that system. You can keep trying, but you're a sinner and you're never going to be anything but a sinner. But you can quit that and transfer into the new system of Jesus, where all your sin will be washed from you. You'll be transferred into the position of good standing before God, and it'll never change forever. You will always be in the blessing position with God. That's what they were faced with, the end of the old and the beginning of the new. And so that's what no sinner was going to enter into the kingdom of heaven, because all the sinners were in the body of Moses. When they left that, they went into the new kingdom, which what? Brought an end to transgression, which brought atonement, which made a removal of sin. Just like John said, they were incapable of sinning. So Mercy, as we kind of move into the New Testament, obviously this is where the rubber hits the road, because we are seeing that transfer between the old system, that old covenant agreement of faithful obedience fulfilled in Christ, who was the faithful obedient one. What would you say it sticks out to you as far as that covenantal language that might be a hump for people, as we kind of summarize here the end of our conversation, hopefully as a, just opening the door, because it's just obviously, you guys listening know, there's just too much to be said about this stuff. But the beginning, we've at least got the basic message out from Sinai to New Covenant. Old Covenant to New Covenant was dealing with those transgressions under the old. What would you say people need to hold in their mind because we today battle with, we're under sin. If the story that we just put forward, that's right, I'll put it forward, you have to deal with the hot potato. If the story that we put forward is the agreement of Exodus is where the covenant agreement began, and Jesus accomplished it, bringing an end to the ability to fail at that covenant agreement, where do we stand with sin then?
Well, just logically thinking through that, this is, so new for a lot of people. It can be very different and shocking in a way, but it really is good news in the sense of, the law isn't bad. It was just a tutor to teach us righteousness. That's what Paul says. So the law had to be in place. Um, so when we think about this lawful system, Jesus even said, I did not come to abolish it. I came to fulfill it, right? I came to fulfill it. He fulfilled that. And when we read the Bible, we look at it in such an individualistic way here in the West. But the Bible is very collective. It's a collective concept or a story. And that's why Jesus is representing the whole body, the headship. And that's why if Jesus fulfilled it, then everyone else can go into that, right? But now that Jesus has fulfilled it and he has brought in that new covenantal system, um, they are now in the New Jerusalem. So this is still people, audience relevance for those that were in that covenantal system. For those outside of 70 AD, we were never part of that system, right? We were never part of that. So all of these things that we're talking about, again, audience relevance, we have to think about who the audience was. This is in context of the first Adam all the way to the last Adam. We are no longer in that covenantal system. We are now in what? Where we don't want to be in that covenantal system. It's already been proven that it was failed from the get-go. It was going to fail. So we want to come out of that covenantal thinking of the Bible, and we are now the people of God, period. This is now the time when anyone can enter into the presence of God. The New Jerusalem was for their concept, but we can also say, hey, we are the new temple. God is here with us, among us, dwelling with us. So we don't need to experience what they experience. We don't need to go through that whole process because it was written in, we can say in stone or written down to give us a case study of how God dealt with this whole concept of sin and transgression so that he could free us up to have a living relationship, not an obligation or a religious mindset, but a relationship.
And one comparison that really I want to push in here, because I like how you're focusing again on they had a thing, now we have a thing. And that's really important. We got to understand the context through them. To them, what was important? Well, I just want to reread that Exodus agreement where it says, now therefore, the Exodus 19:5, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, me a treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. When we say Jesus fulfilled this, this is what Peter said to the church who received Christ, who left that old system because Jesus fulfilled it. This is what he says to the church who left Moses and went into the kingdom of Jesus. It says, but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you will proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness and into his light. Revelation 1 also says, for he has made us a kingdom of priests to his God. That's a fulfillment of Exodus 19:5. Jesus is called in Revelation the faithful and obedient one. And his people that were in Moses left Moses and joined Jesus. They became the fulfillment of that promise. They became the kingdom of priests and the holy nation, the chosen one of God. Why? Because they were pulled out of the dead, dark body of Moses. That's not for us. They were made sinless according to that covenant. They were made righteous according to that covenant. They were made because they needed to be. But then they were delivered into a new age where there was no sin. That's fantastic because that's the age we were born into. We were born into an age that we can now simply understand anything in my mind that I can invent on my own that says, this is preventing me from coming to God. God says, Jesus. And he's like, okay, I didn't tithe enough. God says, Jesus paid for that. Okay. I was really rude to my mom last week. Oh, Jesus paid for that. Okay. Anything that you can come up with. Oh, I murdered. Ah, Jesus paid for that. Paul kind of sums this up in the statement, all things are permissible, but not all things are beneficial. I can go out and commit adultery. That doesn't necessarily mean God now no longer wants relationship with me. But what it does do is it destroys my marriage. In fact, it's a reflection of a destroyed marriage, a problemed marriage. So those things you're doing are definitely permissible in the sense that God's not going to just leave you because you made a bad choice. But at the same time, he's not going to shelter you from your bad choice. So go ahead and do those things and find out what it's like. Lose your children, lose your wife, get stuck paying half your salary in child support so that you can barely eat macaroni. Go and live that life to find out, God is still there holding his son who's crying. He didn't leave, but you definitely, reap the benefits of your labors. But sin isn't the problem. We don't have a sin problem. We have a I don't trust God loves me problem. Why will God love me? Because he created you. It's done. That's your testimony. You are here. God made you and now has an opportunity. And this is what we can learn from that amazing idea, that amazing picture that there's no sin. Anywhere at any time, any person can come to God because there's nothing between man and God. That was the picture of Jesus. There's not a sin, there's not a mistake. Nothing you can shoot at will ever gain you entrance because that's not a requirement. What's the requirement? God being the greater, having mercy to come down and meet us, the lesser. God's character. And that's what we got to really grasp onto. The Bible, as Paul says, now the character of God has been revealed apart from the law. Who God is not revealed in the rules he makes. I love my child with all my heart. And I tell him, if you jump on that couch, we're going to have a bad time. All that law that I just put on my son did was show that I value my couch. It doesn't tell you whether I love or hate my son. We try to see God through a list of actions that we can stand and proclaim before him. God, you must love me. You must accept me. You must take me in. Why? Because I've got A, B, C, and D here that says you have to. What we don't want to do is simply say, God, I trust that you accept me because you're who you are. That's the faith. We just trust him. We just trust. And that's it. That's the image of Jesus. That's the most important image ever created in the history of man's mind is Jesus. Because that means God, irregardless of your behavior, will accept you, just like any parent does of their child. Let me ask you this, Mercy. You've got children now, but there was a time when you didn't have children, obviously. When you were that person and you didn't have a child, you knew at one point you were going to, right? Did you already believe in your heart you were going to love them?
Absolutely.
So you're telling me that before you even had children, you already devoted your love to them. Are you a good person or are you a sinner by biblical transgressional stakes?
I'm not a sinner.
Well, I would be. I wouldn't. I can't live up to those stipulations. I would never be able to. Now, I'd take that your statement there. I was the same way. I didn't have kids at one point too, but I knew I would, and at one point I was going to love them. Now, me, according to the stipulations of that covenant agreement, I would have been a sinner as well. But you're telling me that a sinner, as wrongfully as I can stand, can look at my kid with greater love than God can? Because I, no matter what, have already devoted my love to my kid who doesn't even exist. And then my kid comes, and no matter what that kid does, even if he becomes a murderer, I might not approve of his behavior, but I'm still visiting him in jail. The love never goes because the love was never earned. And that's the same with God. What did we do to earn God's love? What did you do to make God say, I want to create you? Nothing. What did you do that made God say, I can't have relationship with you? Nothing. That's God's choice. And what was God's choice given to Israel, an example for us? I will never forsake you nor leave you. So you can take him at his word and trust him. That's the message of the Bible, not to be afraid of your actions. Name one action group that's morally not historically proven out to at some point become irresponsible. Everybody's systems fail at some point. If we were to if I were to, yeah, I'll finish on this picture because I think this is a really good picture of this. So my son at 2 years old comes out from his bedroom, Dad, Dad, Dad. Yes, and I love my son, and my son loves me. And he goes, Dad, I love you, and I love you, son. And everything's great. Next year comes by, comes out at 3, Dad, I love you, and I love you, son, and we hug, and everything's great. 4 years old, 5 years old, love you, love you. Then something weird happens around the age of 9, 10, 11 years old. You hear this voice from the bedroom, Dad, come here. And you go into that bedroom and you open the door, and he's got this big thing set up with Lego and racetracks everywhere. He's like, look at what I did. Now will you love me? And then you realize you've never actually been in relationship with your son. That's the abomination, is the son who thinks he needs to do to get his father's love. That's the abomination. Sin isn't part of that picture. Sin was an agreement between God and Israel didn't live up to that agreement. So God sent a Messiah to save all those who would be willing to walk away from all those old things and begin something new with him. That's what that was about. As far as humanity is with God, God's a lot bigger than our ability to understand a rightful choice. We cannot put God into a box in which God is so righteous that he would rather put you in an eternity of hell, make you cease to exist, because he can't get over his own ego because you ate some bad fish. Like, that's just the way reality works. That's the way a legal system works, an agreement. That's for those of you who are married, you said to your wife or to your husband, I promise to do such and such. Would you really leave them if they did such and such? Because that's the issue Israel was with God. We're not in that situation with God. God was with Israel and he said, if you do such and such, I'm going to have to leave you. And Israel said, screw it. Let's see what happens. And they didn't do it. So God left them. But he didn't take zero. He created a door, which was Jesus, which opened to a new kingdom, which all those that could be saved were saved through. And that brought an end to that agreement. That brought an end to the ability to break that agreement. That brought the ability to enter that agreement. Anyone born after that agreement ended, as much as you want, you're not under that agreement. You can't break that agreement. You can't sin. It's just what it is. That's the context that we have to read the Bible in, not because I say so, not because Mercy says so, because that's the world it was created in. And if we take it any further beyond that, we have chosen to impose our sensibilities over that in which it was written for. So there's my closing, Mercy. I know we've kind of gone over a huge thing. What would you like to say to kind of close off the idea here? We're cracking a little bit of a can of worms, so everything's up for fair game.
Well, I just think this is such a huge stumbling block for everybody, because just like in the system that they were operating back then, this was a very hard concept for them to grasp. If they could have grasped this way back then, God didn't have to go through this whole suzerain vassal treaty system and covenantal system and go through all of that and use the law as a tutor. They could have grasped it then and we could have bypassed all that. But the consciousness of humanity was not ready. So they had to go through, okay, we do blood sacrifices, we go to the temple, God is only here, we do all of this stuff. God just joined them where they were at in whatever reality that they believed they were in and what they felt like was required of them to come into relation with God. But when Jesus came 2000 years ago, that whole system ended. And the new consciousness is, hey, you can come to God freely. Why? Because you don't have to earn or do anything for his love. It is already there. He already accepts you. And the humanity piece, even it's been 2000 years later, we still struggle with that. This is supposed to be good news. And when I share this with Christians, they freak out And they're like, no, we are sinners. We want to be in that system. It's like, no, 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 you don't want to be. I'm trying to explain to you, no, that system will end it. So it's very hard. I understand that because we have been inundated, indoctrinated to believe otherwise. But truly, since 2,000 years ago, guys, God has freed us to come to Him in this fashion. And are we big enough now, 2,000 years later, to begin to actually walk it out? This is the good news, and we want freedom. We're not saying that there's no bad behavior or bad thinking or anything. That's just going to be always in the mix because we're human. We have a human nature, but this sinful nature and this sin problem and oh, we have to get rid of it. And somehow I have to ask for forgiveness, or I have to do this or pay tithes or all of this kind of thing. That ended 2,000 years ago. We are now in a new consciousness and a new awareness and reality, and the Bible actually says so. We just have to learn how to read it as it says so that we can be free to love Him and to receive Him if we want.
And one thing that jumped into my head as you're saying that, now we're not saying, well, I'll let Mercy speak for herself on this. I am not saying that this is universalism, that every single human being now is going to go and be with God as a result of this. I still am as the position, from what I've seen in the Bible, that God will not force Himself to make it so that you have to be. That doesn't seem to be His motive, but rather He likes to give you the option. Like we just went this whole video talking about an agreement. He gave them a choice. Do you or do you not want to go in this with me? God gives humans the option to engage in relationship with Him. And so I'm now of the position that those who are in relationship, so we are in a world still today of light and darkness. Light and darkness will never leave us. We can still be in truth and we can still be out of truth. We can have light and darkness in so many different ways in our lives. We can parallel that example. But the image is we're in death, we're in darkness, we're in suffering. We're apart, we're away from that which makes us whole and makes us function. When we transfer into the light, we reverse all that. We see that in the curses. Those who live by the curses and those who live by the blessings. They're literally the exact opposite. The cursing is, if you don't do this, I'll take you off the land. If you do this, I'll put you on good land. So they're literally the opposite. That image is for us still today. There's those who want to walk with God. And there's simply those who just don't want it. And that's their choice. God, I don't believe, is going to force Himself upon anyone. That's not necessary. That doesn't mean that God doesn't interact in the world. Absolutely, He does. This is His world, is the point. But at the same time, He's not going to do forceful. And so, what does that mean at the end? Who really knows? Who really knows? The Bible doesn't profess to even know. So, how can we be so boisterous to say it ourselves? But I do believe that those who know Him now, when we move on, whatever that looks like, we'll know Him then.
Mhm.
But I'm also of the position, if we don't know Him now, why would we all of a sudden know Him then? The Bible's clear. He's not the God of the dead, He's the God of the living. We can either be alive and in light with Him now, or we can be dead in darkness now. Why would my death all of a sudden turn me into light? So to me, I'm of the position, it's not universalism, it's a universal message. This is a message for everyone, but not everyone wants it.
Mhm.
Is there anything else you'd like to finish off there, Mercy?
I just want to say the reality of us coming into partnership with God, realizing who He is, how much He loves us and humanity and this world. It's just a better life if you know that and you do life with Him. It just really is. That's my testimony. So I really encourage people to, to be open to that, you know.
Well, fantastic. Hopefully, this conversation has made you guys get some deeper thoughts, interesting thoughts, maybe brought up some stuff you've never even considered before ever. Maybe I'm just a wackadoodle, but whatever it is, it was good conversation. I hope you had fun, Mercy.
You.
Awesome. We'll continue on again because if we're not talking something controversial, then what's the point of talking then? So we'll think up something good for next week. And until then, we hope you have a good week. And wherever you are. I hope God blesses you. Have a good one. Bye bye.